Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast. Today, two reports say the two most important environmental regulators, Natural England and the Environment Agency, are not up to scratch. Should they be merged?
I am worried that doing that would take years of change. It would cost a lot of money, and we might lose out on having a dedicated nature champion in government.
We'll have more on that a little later. First, this week we've been taking a look back through history to discover the foundations of our farming and landscape. Now, if you've ever wondered why we have so many hedges or why rural Britain looks like it does today, you have to go back to one of the most seismic events which happened over 200 years ago, the Enclosure Act. It not only shaped what we see in the countryside, but also changed rural communities forever. Sarah Falkingham reports from one of the counties which was particularly affected.
I'm just north of Bridlington in a field which is being power harrowed, and we'll come back to the farmer in a minute. But in this county, 70% of parishes had enclosure awards. They were legal changes. Before that, since Anglo-Saxon times, villagers had farmed strips, not owned them. And then between 1750 and 1850, the landowners wanted to consolidate all of those strips into private rectangular plots. And I'm walking this field with Hannah Stamp, who's an archivist from East Riding of Yorkshire Council. Hannah, why was there a push for a change to all these strips?
Farmers during the 18th and 19th centuries were wanting to consolidate their land to make it much more profitable. They wanted to experiment with innovative new techniques with regards to rotation of crops, much more consistent methods of farming, and just to increase the amount of produce that they were making on the farms. But it caused great societal upheaval at the time.
So what was the impact then?
The rural poor, they had to go and, there was a great migration into the towns like Beverley, Bridlington, and the cities like Hull. As people were displaced, they had been working the strips of land for centuries, but they didn't own it. So when the Enclosure Acts came about, the ownership of the land changed and they lost their communal rights and their access to that land.
So we're going to walk up a hedge alongside this field to try and catch up with Stephen Atkinson, who's power harrowing this land today, which would have looked completely different 200 years ago, to show him some maps and ask him about the size of this field now. It's a busy day, a lot of land work to do. How big is this field that you're doing here?
74 acres.
So, Hannah, you've got some maps just to show what this field may have looked like 200 years ago.
This map dates from 1772 and it's a pre-enclosure map showing the fields around Speeton, and it just goes into the Grindal Lordship as well. You can see some of the old field names. Raghill Slack, so Slack being a depression in the landscape. And because we're in a parish on the coast, you can also use these maps to trace coastal erosion. The later enclosure maps show the parcels of land divided up and hedged off. These hedges are physical boundaries as well as being legal boundaries.
So the field we're in here, has it always been 74 acres?
No, it will be split into 4 fields at one point.
So about 15 to 20 acres per field.
Yeah.
One of the impacts of all this was that over one century, between 1750 and 1850, 200,000 miles of new hedge was planted, more in one century than in the previous 500 years. And we can still see that. We just walked up a brand new hedge, which you put in, but all around us are hedges. I suppose that's the landmark of Britain.
It is, yeah. We've kept most of ours, which is good for wildlife.
Do you have any hedges that go back 200 years?
I would think some of them will be, yes. Some of the trees that are planted are obviously newer, but some of them are a lot older.
Stephen Atkinson there. And tomorrow we'll be looking at labour-saving high-tech for Victorian farmers. Now, most people love to see and hear a skein of geese flying overhead, but in Scotland it can make farmers and crofters more than a little uncomfortable knowing that their grass or barley could become the birds' dinner. It seems climate change and other developments are presenting some knotty problems, and Scottish farmers want more government action over goose management. So how big is the problem, and are there answers? Richard Baines has been finding out.
I'm taking the short ferry ride to the island of Ling, off the Argyll coast, south of Oban. It's one of many places in Scotland where geese are causing a problem for farmers and crofters. Here on the western seaboard, warmer weather brought by climate change is allowing more geese of all species to survive and thrive. But there are other factors.
Better quality grass swards being created.
I'm travelling with Alistair McGugan, goose expert with the government wildlife agency Nature Scot, who's here to talk to farmers.
For example, on Islay, putting more fertiliser out onto the fields, that's then creating better conditions for geese such as Greenland barnacles to overwinter in better condition and go back to their breeding grounds in Greenland in better condition.
So what problems do geese cause? Here on Ling, Archie Cadzow is doing battle with the birds on the family's beef and sheep farm.
20 years ago, we probably didn't see an awful lot here of any geese, maybe a few migratory ones, but now we see resident Canada and grey-lag geese, and then we see barnacle geese coming down to overwinter. And they come in much larger numbers, big 500 strong groups. The way they do graze is that they pull the whole root out of the ground, and that plant can't regenerate. We are just walking through one of our lower fields. So here we've got some Canadas. What we have found is where there is standing water and the geese are drawn to that, they can then exacerbate things by grass cover sort of falling back and bare earth. Starts clogging the drainage system.
What can you do about it?
Scare them away. Barnacle are protected. We are encouraged to shoot Canadas, and you can set up these systems, your classic crow scarer, but they get quite used to that. So no, our options are drive at them with a quad bike and try and push them off.
There are many communities across the Western Islands which have geese problems.
They trample crops, in particular the beer barley crop, which is kind of a shorter height plant, and the geese consume it in vast quantities.
John Gillies is from Storus Uist, the community owner of the South Uist crofting estate in the Outer Hebrides. There are around 9,000 grey-lag geese there.
The geese defecate all over grass which the sheep and cattle eat. It causes the sheep to become very ill. Every interaction with the geese population causes damage to the crofters.
There is some Nature Scot money in the Western Isles for goose problems, but John Gillies says it's not enough.
If a goose is laying, between 6 and 8 eggs, and half of those eggs are turning into chicks that are surviving, and half the geese population is female, they're never going to kill enough geese to actually reduce the size of the flock.
We're not getting such hard winters as we were previously. So some of our migratory geese, particularly greylags, coming in from Iceland and other species coming in from Greenland, they're not going as far south, so they're staying up in, say, Caithness and Orkney. And that's then multiplying the problem for the farmers in Orkney, who are already dealing with about 24,000 greylag that are breeding there all the year round.
One of the solutions on Orkney has been to permit the sale of goose meat to encourage shooting. But each location and each species requires a different set of solutions.
Let's take barnacle geese on Islay, the Greenland barnacle geese. There we do have a management scheme. The farmers are reseeding a ground that's protected, or on another area where it's a feeding area, so therefore you're not allowed to scare them on those fields. So they're able to use different fields for different purposes, and there is a payment there for that. But there is also lethal control going on, lethal scaring going on.
The National Farmers Union Scotland has called for urgent action over geese from the government. Scottish Agriculture Minister Jim Fairley says the government spends £1 million a year on goose mitigation and is working with stakeholders on new ways forward after a policy review. And it's just announced an extra £20,000 to cut goose numbers in the Uists and the neighbouring island of Barra.
Richard Baines reporting. MPs on the Public Accounts Committee have called for the merger of the Environment Agency and Natural England. In a report out today, the committee was highly critical of both organisations, saying that environmental regulators are spread too thin to protect nature while delivering reforms. Natural England designates areas of outstanding natural beauty and sites of special scientific interest. It oversees access to open country and enforces regulations. It also administers the Countryside Stewardship Scheme and environmentally sensitive areas and carries out its own scientific research into conservation. The Environment Agency, which covers the whole of the UK, was set up to protect the environment. It manages waste and pollution regulations and is in charge of flood protection and water quality. It also inspects farms and enforces regulations in England. Well, Richard Benwell is Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link, which represents dozens of conservation groups. I asked him if a merger of the Environment Agency and Natural England was the right way to go.
We definitely need to make a change to ensure that regulators can keep up with people who aren't obeying the rules and give good advice for how people can go about restoring the environment. So I understand why there needs to be change. As for merging the two regulators, well, we're more interested in function than form, and I am worried that doing that would take years, it would cost a lot of money, and we might lose out on having a dedicated nature champion in government, which has been so important from Natural England.
The Public Accounts Committee was pretty damning. Environmental regulators are spread too thin to protect nature. They don't believe regulators have the resources and skills to manage upcoming changes. There's a lack of strategic direction from DEFRA, which limits Natural England and the Environment Agency from doing their job properly.
Those are all valid concerns. We're starting to see that turn round with some funding injections, but a lot of that's been capital, big project stuff, rather than the people power they need to get boots on the ground to do enforcement and advice. So that funding part is definitely true. And the other part of the picture is the freedom to operate and go after those environmental priorities. Too often we've seen governments interfering on a short-term basis to say, don't enforce those rules, they're inconvenient, or don't make that investment because we need to save some money right now.
DEFRA, though, would say that they have taken a lot of action to address some of the criticisms. A few days ago, they set out their Waste Crime Action Plan, a zero-tolerance approach to waste crime. The Environment Agency says it's expanding its enforcement activity. There'll be more boots on the ground. So they say they are addressing the problems that you've outlined.
We're starting to see some things go in the right direction again. So yes, it's good to see more investigators in the Environment Agency. We understand that government's looking at speeding up the way that enforcement happens. But there are a lot of changes coming, and we don't yet know how they're going to shake out. So one of the biggest and most important will be the new water regulator.
We've also had the National Audit Office, which published its report. They look specifically at tree planting and peatland restoration. They said that both were behind the set targets and suggested that the targets themselves needed to be revisited. But DEFRA said rates in England for tree planting are now at their highest level in over 20 years, and they've allocated £1 billion towards tree planting and support into the forestry sector. Do you think the targets need to be reset?
No, the action needs to be reset. So if anything, the targets still leave us behind the rest of Europe. So there's a huge long way to go. And the Nature for Climate Fund has been working. It started really to ramp up those tree planting rates. But the government now needs to give that long-term confidence that these funds aren't just there when there's a little bit of extra money floating around. This is investment in natural infrastructure.
Richard Benwell from Wildlife and Countryside Link. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer was Rebecca Rooney. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.